In September of 1995, two sisters from an isolated religious community in rural Montana vanished without a trace during what should have been a routine trip to the local farmers market. Elizabeth, 19, and Tabitha, 17, never made it to their destination. For 9 long years, their parents and their community lived in total uncertainty, refusing to call in the sheriff's department out of deep mistrust for the outside world. Then in 2004, construction workers near an abandoned lead mine made a discovery that froze the entire region in fear. At the bottom of a forgotten shaft, they found a wooden wagon, preserved almost perfectly by the damp air of the mine. It belonged to the Roussillon sisters, but that was only the beginning. Alongside the wagon, investigators uncovered objects that instantly turned what had long been considered a mystery into a full-scale criminal investigation. Objects that suggested Elizabeth and Tabitha hadn't been the victims of a tragic accident, but of a carefully orchestrated abduction carried out by someone who knew their community's routines intimately. How could two young women, raised in simplicity and faith, have become the targets of such a calculated crime? And what does that wagon, hidden underground for 9 years, truly reveal? Before we unravel this disturbing story, let's return to where it all began. Montana in 1995 was still a land of stark contrasts. In one of the state's most sparsely populated counties, vast prairies and mountains were home to communities that had chosen to live on the margins of modern America. Among them, the Brothers of the New Covenant had settled in the late 1960s in a remote hamlet outside Helena. The group of about 50 had been founded by Ezra Roussillon, a former engineer from Chicago who, after the unrest of the late 60s, abandoned city life to create a society rooted in traditional Christian values and a return to the land. Unlike the Amish, they didn't forbid modern technology entirely, but strictly limited it to what was necessary for survival. They owned a few tractors for heavy farm work, a generator for the carpentry shop, and even one communal telephone in Ezra's house. But television, radio, and newspapers were banned, viewed as corrupting influences. Women wore long dresses and head coverings, the men full beards without mustaches. Their English, shaped by years of religious expressions and archaic turns of phrase, set them apart from outsiders. Elizabeth and Tabitha Roussillon were Ezra and Rachel's daughters. Rachel, once a school teacher, had embraced the contemplative life. Elizabeth, the eldest, embodied the values of her community. Tall, slender, with light brown hair always braided neatly, she carried herself with the calm assurance of someone who knew her place in the world. She taught the youngest children and excelled in sewing and weaving. Tabitha, shorter and rounder, had inherited her mother's piercing green eyes and possessed a curiosity that often set her apart. While she respected the community's rules, she was known to watch passing cars with longing or ask uncomfortable questions about the outside world. At 17, this was tolerated, but some elders whispered concern about her influence on the younger children. The community sustained itself through organic farming and craftsmanship. Their vegetables, goat cheese, and hand-carved furniture sold well at regional markets in Helena and even occasionally in Missoula. Their visits were tightly scheduled by the Council of Elders. Families had assigned days, assigned markets, and designated routes. This strict system minimized outside contact while ensuring economic survival. Locals respected them as hardworking and honest, but relations never went beyond business. That distance had roots in the group's history. Ezra often recalled how, in the early years, they were victims of theft and vandalism, and subjected to relentless inspections from local authorities. Over time, the Brothers of the New Covenant learned to manage everything internally: justice, education, health. Their autonomy brought peace, but also isolation, and that isolation would prove fatal. Thursday, September 21, 1995, dawned with the heavy autumn fog that often blanketed the Montana valleys like a sea of cotton. As always, the community began the day with 6 a.m. prayer, followed by breakfast and the assignment of chores. That morning, Elizabeth and Tabitha had been tasked with taking goat cheese, jars of preserves, and hand-carved wooden trinkets to the Helena market. The 20-mile route along State Highway 12 was one they knew by heart. Ezra estimated it at 2.5 hours with Esperanza, their 12-year-old draft horse. Rachel prepared her daughter's breakfast with unusual care, not from superstition, which the community avoided, but because it was Tabitha's first trip without adult supervision. At 17, she was deemed ready, but Rachel couldn't shake her maternal unease. By 8:30, the sisters had loaded their wagon under the watchful eye of Samuel Beaumont, a 22-year-old carpenter who was quietly in love with Elizabeth. Tall, dark-haired, his hands calloused from work, Samuel hoped one day to be chosen as her husband. That morning he carefully tied down the crates and checked the harness. "Be careful near Three Crosses Bend," he warned Elizabeth. Yesterday, Father Matthias saw fresh tire tracks in the mud, cars cutting across where they don't belong. Elizabeth smiled at his mixture of caution and jealousy. "We'll be careful, Samuel. We'll be back by sunset, as promised." At 9 o'clock sharp, the sisters left, waved off by the gathered community. Tabitha, thrilled with her first independent trip, chatted eagerly as Esperanza trotted onto the dirt road leading toward the highway. Around 9:45, the rural mail carrier, Gerald Fowler, spotted them crossing the bridge over Rock Creek. He knew the sisters well and exchanged a few friendly words. Tabitha proudly showed him a basket of preserves she had made herself, while Elizabeth checked her pocket watch to stay on schedule. They seemed perfectly normal, he would later testify. Elizabeth, serious as ever. Tabitha, more playful. The horse calm, the wagon steady. Nothing unusual at all. At 10:15, a farmer named Mary Burrell, busy milking her cows, heard the distinct jingling of the bells Ezra always attached to his horse's harnesses. She stepped outside just in time to see the sisters' wagon pass by. She recognized them instantly, but the distance and noise of the cattle kept her from calling out. That was the last confirmed sighting of Elizabeth and Tabitha Roussillon. By noon, Henry Malloy, a farm equipment salesman who knew the community's routines well, began to wonder why Elizabeth and Tabitha hadn't shown up at their usual spot at the Helena Farmers Market. The brothers of the New Covenant were known for their absolute punctuality, and their goods always sold quickly to local families who valued their quality. By 2 o'clock, Henry's mild concern had turned into real alarm. He walked the entire market, asked other vendors, and checked the nearby streets where the wagon might have been parked. There was no sign of the Roussillon sisters or their horse. Knowing the community's distrust of outside authorities, Henry took it upon himself to drive straight out to their settlement. The trip took him about 40 minutes, and by the time he arrived, around 3 o'clock, he found the community already gripped by fear. Ezra Roussillon, usually a man of calm authority, could not mask his growing panic. Rachel, pale as a sheet, clutched the younger children as though afraid they might vanish next. Samuel Beaumont paced the courtyard, eyes fixed on the dirt road in desperate hope that Esperanza's familiar silhouette might appear. "My daughters are never late," Ezra repeated to Henry. Never. Even when Tabitha was little and stopped to pick flowers, Elizabeth always kept them on time. Something's happened. By 4 o'clock, the Council of Elders had convened an emergency meeting. After nearly an hour of intense debate, they made a rare decision: to send 3 search parties down the possible routes the sisters might have taken. Samuel led one group straight toward Helena. A second was sent in the direction of a neighboring town, in case the girls had strayed. Ezra himself took charge of the third, combing through every side road and shortcut he knew. They searched until nightfall, finding nothing. No wagon, no horse, no trace of Elizabeth or Tabitha. It was as if they had vanished into thin air along a well-traveled stretch of road. Only the following morning, after a sleepless night of prayer and agonized discussion, did Ezra finally take the step he had dreaded. He drove to the Lewis and Clark County Sheriff's Department to file an official missing persons report. But that 24-hour delay, born of the community's convictions and long-standing mistrust of authorities, would severely complicate the investigation. Sheriff's Captain John Martin, head of the Helena substation, received Ezra with a mixture of professionalism and perplexity. He had patrolled these rural valleys for 15 years and knew the strange balance between modern life and the old ways. The investigation began with standard procedures, but the lost day had already reduced the chance of quick answers. Deputies interviewed every possible witness along the sisters' route, searched ditches and roadside woods, checked hospitals, and contacted veterinarians in case Esperanza had been abandoned or injured somewhere. That Sunday, a full search was organized with nearly 50 volunteers, mostly local hunters who knew the land intimately. They scoured every trail, clearing, and abandoned cabin. They even swept sinkholes and caves scattered throughout the region. Nothing, Very quickly, investigators were forced to accept the obvious. This was no accident. But without a motive, the criminal theory hit a wall. Elizabeth and Tabitha had no enemies, no relationships outside their community, no valuables that might tempt a thief. Their way of life shielded them from drugs, money disputes, and complicated romances. The idea of a runaway was dismissed outright. Elizabeth was deeply rooted in her faith and her role as teacher. Everyone agreed she was emotionally stable and mature. Tabitha, though curious about the outside world, had never expressed the slightest desire to leave, and both had been carrying a full load of goods for market, something they would never abandon voluntarily. As weeks turned into months, the investigation bogged down in unanswered questions. Accident? But where were the bodies? The wagon? The horse? Abduction? But by whom and why? Robbery? But the sisters never carried much cash, and their goods, while valuable, were hardly a fortune. The brothers of the New Covenant sank into the darkest chapter of their existence. Ezra seemed to age 10 years in a matter of months, his hair graying, his shoulders slumping, his once bright eyes dulled by sorrow. Rachel developed a crippling agoraphobia, unable to leave the settlement. She spent her days sewing dresses for children who would never wear them, setting 3 plates at every meal as if her daughters might return at any moment, and jumping at every sound in the courtyard. Samuel's pain was the most visible. His quiet devotion to Elizabeth, once hidden behind the strict codes of the community, now erupted in outbursts of anger and despair. He drove endlessly along country roads, scanning every face he saw, pestering deputies with theories and demands for updates. Fear infected the younger children. Parents no longer let them wander even for simple chores. The once trusting community became rigid, controlled, and suspicious. The economic strain was just as real. Elizabeth and Tabitha had been skilled workers, their sewing, weaving, and teaching not easily replaced. Market sales plummeted. Few dared travel the cursed stretch of road where the sisters disappeared. But the greatest wound was spiritual. How could God allow such a fate to befall 2 pure, faithful young women? Daily prayers became desperate pleas. Ezra's sermons lost their former strength, breaking down into painful silences and unanswered questions. Some members began to doubt the very foundations of their way of life. Had their isolation left them more vulnerable? Had their mistrust of authorities cost the sisters their chance at rescue? As autumn gave way to a brutal Montana winter, snow buried every trace investigators might have hoped to find. By December, the search was formally suspended until spring. To the Roussellins, it felt like the system had already forgotten their daughters. But Captain Martin had not. Methodical and stubborn, he kept rechecking witness statements, testing alibis, and chasing even the thinnest of leads. He was especially intrigued by Samuel's account of tire tracks near Three Crosses Bend the day before the sisters vanished. But storms had long since washed away any hope of evidence. Spring 1996 brought a fleeting surge of hope. Volunteer spelunkers joined the search, exploring the countless caves and sinkholes dotting the region. But the results were the same: nothing. By summer, a new theory surfaced among investigators. What if the Roussellin sisters had fallen prey to a larger criminal network? Their isolation, their predictable movements, their ignorance of the outside world, these made them ideal targets for traffickers seeking cheap labor or victims to exploit. The case was elevated nationwide. Alerts were sent to sheriff's departments across the country, and even the FBI was looped in. But still, no concrete leads. The years passed: 1997, 1998, 1999. Each anniversary reopened the wound, each time reigniting hope and then extinguishing it again. Reporters came by now and then to interview the family. A few television shows devoted a couple of minutes to the Montana mystery, but public attention faded fast. The brothers of the New Covenant drew in on themselves. Shaken by the tragedy and the questions it raised, several families left the hamlet, some joining other religious groups, others returning to conventional life. Numbers fell to around 30, threatening the community's economic survival. Samuel Beaumont left in 2001, no longer able to bear the absence of the woman he had loved in silence. He joined an Anabaptist community across the state line, hoping to find the peace he could no longer find at home. Before leaving, he told Ezra Roussellin, "I can't accept that she's dead without knowing how or why. But I also can't live with the idea she might be alive somewhere and I can't help her." Captain John Martin, later promoted and transferred to a larger post in 2002, handed the file to his successor with a sense of professional failure that would follow him into retirement. In his final notes, he wrote, "This case bears all the hallmarks of a meticulously planned crime by individuals intimately familiar with the Russelin community's routines. The total absence of physical trace suggests exceptional premeditation and significant means to disappear not just two people, but a horse and a wagon." On Tuesday, June 15, 2004, something completely unexpected reignited the investigation in the most dramatic way. Cross & Fields Construction, a family-owned firm based in Bozeman, had won a contract to rehabilitate an abandoned lead mine near the ghost town of Elkhorn, roughly 20 miles from the New Covenant hamlet. The site had sat derelict since the 1970s. While the tunnels had been sealed for safety, the vertical access shafts had never been fully filled. The project aimed to convert part of the old quarry into a geological interpretive center for tourists, while permanently securing hazardous zones. Company owner Jerome Cross put his most experienced foreman, Mike Prater, a 53-year-old veteran of mine country work, in charge. Prater knew mines held surprises, uncharted galleries, unstable ground. His 6-man crew began by mapping every visible opening and sweeping for voids with cavity detectors. During this preliminary phase, they identified a secondary shaft, likely dug late in the mine's life to drain seepage, that appeared on no official plan. About 6.5 feet across, it was hidden under decades of brush. Only a faint circular depression, visible in the low angle of the morning light, betrayed its presence. Prater decided it had to be explored to assess any risk to the project. The descent was scheduled for Friday, June 18th. He brought in a professional caver, Lawrence Larry Mercer, who had the gear and certifications to make a safe entry. Echo tests put the depth at around 50 feet. Routine. Mercer began his descent at 9 a.m. The crew gathered around the rim. The first feet revealed nothing unusual. A rock wall typical of lead country, a few tree roots working through fissures, the expected mulch of dead leaves and debris. At roughly 40 feet, Mercer stopped. His voice crackled up through the echoing shaft, and the tone alone told Prater something was wrong. "There's something man-made down here, something that doesn't belong." The first items hoisted to the surface baffled the crew. A wooden wheel bound in iron, old but remarkably preserved by the shaft's constant damp. Then oak planks joined with hand-forged nails. Finally, leather harness parts still showing the wear of heavy use. It didn't take an expert to realize they were bringing up the remains of a wagon. But how had a wagon found its way to the bottom of an abandoned mine shaft? And why had it been taken apart so carefully before being dumped in a hole in the middle of nowhere? Prater, a practical man used to odd finds, halted the job on the spot and called the Lewis and Clark County Sheriff's Department. Experience told him this was far more than a historical curiosity. The wagon had been deliberately disassembled and hidden, strongly suggesting a crime. The call set off a chain reaction that jolted a 9-year dormant case. Sergeant Phil Esco, who took the report, immediately thought of the Rousselin sisters when he heard dismantled wagon in a shaft. Captain Mary Frances Cross, newly assigned to head investigations out of Helena for the past 6 months, was only just absorbing the Rousselin file, a stack of thick binders handed down by predecessors. 42, academy-trained and steeped in modern investigative methods, she approached the discovery with fresh eyes and quiet resolve. Her first move was to lock down the site and request the Montana State Crime Lab out of Missoula. If this wagon belonged to Elizabeth and Tabitha, every retrieved piece might hold DNA or trace evidence that 2004 technology could actually use. Under law enforcement supervision, Mercer continued the methodical retrieval, foot by foot, bringing up everything in the shaft. Along with the wagon parts came items that erased doubt about identity. A silver pocket watch engraved with the initials ER, the one Ezra had given Elizabeth on her 10th birthday, and a blue wool shawl that Rachel recognized instantly as the one she knitted for Tabitha the winter before the girls vanished. Then came the find that forever recast the mystery as a homicide investigation. At the bottom of the shaft, wrapped carefully in heavy industrial plastic sheeting, Mercer uncovered bones. Not full skeletons, fragments. Enough to suggest the remains of at least 2 individuals. Preliminary analysis by Dr. Sylvia Martell, a forensic anthropologist working with the state medical examiner, indicated female remains, one consistent with a 19-year-old woman, the other with a teenager between 16 and 18. The bones showed no obvious signs of trauma, but their condition and the way they were scattered suggested they'd been moved more than once. The questions multiplied. Why were the bodies disarticulated? Why was the wagon meticulously dismantled before being dumped? And most troubling, how did the killers know about a secondary shaft invisible from the surface and missing from every official map? The investigation shifted into a new gear. Captain Cross assembled a specialized team and reopened lines of inquiry on anyone connected to the Elkhorn operation. County archives showed the mine had shut down in 1978, 17 years before the sisters disappeared. Many former miners were retired and living quietly in the area, but their memories shed light on the forgotten shaft. Several confirmed the existence of the auxiliary drain, dug in the operation's final years to pump out infiltration that made work increasingly difficult. One former foreman, 73-year-old Mark Boniface, remembered it clearly. "We called it the Devil's Hole because it was dangerous and didn't do much except move water. It was well hidden. You had to know where to look. We only went out there when the pumps went bad." His interview yielded a crucial detail. The shaft could be reached by an old logging road, allowing a vehicle to approach without passing the mine's main gate. That hidden logging road, once used to service drainage pumps, gave someone the perfect access point to quietly dispose of incriminating evidence. Investigators now focused on identifying who could have known about both the shaft and the Rousselin sisters' routines. It was clear this crime hadn't been random. The kidnappers had planned it with precision, chosen the site carefully, and orchestrated the abduction with chilling familiarity. That's when the name Frank Morrell surfaced. A 50-year-old electrician, Frank lived in a small house midway between the Rousselin settlement and the old Elkhorn mine. His father, John Morrell, had worked as an electrician at the mine until it shut down in 1978. Frank wasn't a stranger to law enforcement. He'd been convicted in 1989 for possession of child pornography, and again in 1992 for the attempted abduction of a minor. In hindsight, those convictions cast a dark shadow over his proximity to the case. He still lived alone in the isolated family home, surrounded by dense woods, with a vantage point ideal for watching the comings and goings along the region's rural roads. Neighbors described him as odd, polite enough in public, but prone to unexplained disappearances that lasted days. More troubling still, Frank had owned a Dodge panel van since 1994, big enough to carry 2 people and a dismantled wagon. He scrapped the vehicle in 1996, barely a year after the sisters disappeared. Captain Cross ordered discreet surveillance while the investigation moved forward. Outwardly, Frank lived a normal life, picking up electrical jobs around the county. But his twitchy behavior had worsened ever since news of the shaft broke. Then came the decisive proof. DNA from the remains confirmed the victims were indeed Elizabeth and Tabitha, and biological traces lifted from Tabitha's shawl included male DNA that did not belong to anyone in the family. That sample was compared against potential suspects, including Frank Morrell. Meanwhile, investigators uncovered something larger than a lone predator. A quiet search of Morrell's home revealed letters, coded, but not so carefully that specialized officers couldn't interpret them. The correspondence pointed to contacts across the state and beyond, men with similar records. They spoke of acquisitions and collections. They described isolated communities as ideal hunting grounds, vulnerable because of their distrust of outside authorities. It was the confirmation investigators dreaded. An organized pedophile ring targeting girls from secluded religious settlements. Their predictable movements, their sheltered lives, their families' reluctance to involve police, all of it made them easy prey. An old testimony now returned with fresh urgency. Samuel Beaumont, tracked down at his new community, repeated what he had seen the day before the sisters vanished. Tire tracks at 3 Crosses Bend. They matched perfectly with the tires once fitted to Frank's Dodge van. The net was tightening. But Captain Cross knew she had to tread carefully. If Frank was part of a larger network, an arrest made too soon might bury their chance of finding his accomplices. So she took a bold step, an undercover infiltration. Disguised as Sylvia Marsh, a social worker researching the struggles of young women from closed religious groups, she approached Frank under the guise of an academic study. It was a role she could play convincingly, She had once trained in psychology before law enforcement, and now that knowledge became her most valuable weapon, she set herself up in a small rental in Helena, fitted with hidden recording gear provided by the state police. Her first meeting with Frank took place in a neutral space, a roadside diner where he felt safe enough to talk. From the start, Captain Cross could sense it. She was sitting across from a deeply disturbed man, intelligent enough to mask his compulsions behind a facade of respectability. To her disguised ears, his words were chilling. He spoke with eerie precision about the habits of the brothers of the New Covenant, their market trips, their strict schedules, their suspicion of outsiders. And worse, he mentioned other isolated groups in Idaho and Wyoming, hinting that his interests reached beyond the Rousselins. These people live in another century, he said with an unsettling smile. They think they're protecting their children from the modern world. But what they're really doing is making them weak. A girl like that doesn't know danger when she sees it. She trusts too easily. Over a series of carefully spaced meetings, Frank opened up. He referred to friends who shared his views, to studies of development, to coded discussions that left no doubt about his real intentions. The turning point came on Friday, August 13th, 2004. Believing he had earned Sylvia's trust, Frank slipped. "I knew two sisters from that community," he said, his voice almost fond. "Beautiful girls. Pure in a way you don't see anymore. Elizabeth and Tabitha. They came to the Helena market often. I spoke to them more than once, very enlightening conversations. It was the first direct admission linking him to the sisters' disappearance. But Captain Cross needed more. Names, methods, proof of the network itself. She pressed, feigning professional curiosity. But those girls disappeared, if I recall. A case never solved. Tragic for my research. The reaction was immediate. Frank froze, hands trembling, eyes darting as if to check the walls were listening. Then, in a low voice, he muttered, "Sometimes subjects disappear on their own, or they find environments more suited to their growth." The concealed microphone in her purse captured every word, an oblique but damning admission. And then he went further. Yes, there were alternative environments, families across several states, re-education centers where young women were prepared for new lives. His euphemisms could not disguise the horror, a human trafficking network targeting sheltered girls. The hardest part, Frank said coldly, is logistics. Making everything vanish, their clothes, their transport, everything that could tell their story. Luckily, I have friends who are very creative with that. That sentence broke the case wide open. It pointed directly to his main accomplice, Gerald Faulkner, a 48-year-old former mine worker turned construction contractor. Faulkner had the expertise to make things disappear in abandoned shafts, and a record to match, rape in 1983. Multiple reports of harassment since. The pieces were falling into place. Their partnership went back to the early 90s, when they met through a re-entry program for former inmates. The final trap was set during one last meeting on Wednesday, August 18th, 2004. This time, Captain Cross steered the conversation toward the logistics of moving young women, pushing Frank to describe the mechanics of their operations. He made the fatal mistake of laying it out in detail. Weeks of surveillance to learn routines, unmarked vehicles to avoid attention, discreet handoff points where victims were transferred to their new environments. Worse, he mentioned a stash site, a shuttered farm near the ghost town of Bannock, where personal effects deemed unnecessary were stored before being recycled or destroyed. According to him, that cache held trophies from a decade of operations. The revelation triggered a full-scale operation. While Morrell remained under quiet surveillance so he couldn't warn anyone, 3 teams moved simultaneously on his house, Gerald Faulkner's place, and the abandoned Bannock farm. The arrests, carried out at dawn on Thursday, August 19th, 2004, capped 9 years of searching and blew open a criminal network far larger than anyone had imagined. Searches at both homes yielded an arsenal of damning evidence. At Morrell's, investigators found a grotesque museum. Hundreds of covert photos of young women, detailed maps of several isolated religious communities, and, most disturbing, a handwritten ledger cataloging potential targets. It logged precise notes on Elizabeth and Tabitha, travel times, clothing habits, even coolly clinical assessments of their adaptability. At Faulkner's, the most chilling discovery was a clandestine workshop outfitted with welding and metal cutting gear. There, the Rousselin sisters' wagon had been carefully dismantled before being dumped into the Elkhorn shaft. He had kept the tools and photographs of the job, like trophies from their perfect crime. But it was the Bannock farm that revealed the full extent of their activities. In a basement converted into a vault, deputies found the network's archives, dozens of folders with identities and photos of potential victims, correspondence with other members across the Mountain West, and personal belongings from multiple missing young women over the past 10 years. Those effects tied Morell and Faulkner to at least 7 other disappearances from secluded religious communities, cold cases in Idaho, Wyoming, and northern New Mexico that suddenly took on a devastating clarity. Interrogations began. With a criminal psychologist at her side, Captain Cross led Morell through the method, a deliberately predatory system targeting young women from communities that preferred to handle problems internally and distrusted outside law enforcement. "We knew those families wouldn't call the police right away," Morell said with chilling detachment. "Their way of life gave us days, sometimes weeks, before anyone started looking. Time to erase everything and move the girls to intake sites." Those intake sites, he admitted, were remote properties where victims were held, broken psychologically, and sold to wealthy clients seeking compliant, pure companions. It was an industry, human trafficking engineered to exploit cultural vulnerabilities. Confronted with the physical evidence from his shop, Faulkner finally confessed. Weeks of surveillance to learn patterns. Choosing an isolated interception point along the routine route. Using a pretext to get the girls out of their wagon. In Elizabeth and Tabitha's case, they faked a van breakdown on the road into Helena, counting on the sisters' instinct for charity. Raised on mutual aid and compassion, they stopped without hesitation. "They trusted us," Faulkner muttered. "Elizabeth even offered to guide us to the nearest garage with their wagon. They had no idea, until we cuffed them in the van." The sisters were taken to the Bannock property, held for days while arrangements were made to transfer them to a conditioning site in northern New Mexico. But unlike other victims who eventually submitted, Elizabeth and Tabitha resisted with a resolve that shocked their captors. Elizabeth especially emerged as a natural leader, organizing whispered prayers, creating simple codes to communicate with Tabitha, always searching for a way out. That resistance became a problem for the network. Clients demanded complete submission, and the conditioning dragged on. After 2 weeks without progress, Morell and Faulkner decided to eliminate them rather than risk 2 witnesses. The exact circumstances remained murky, each man blaming the other. But investigators established that Elizabeth and Tabitha were killed at the Bannock farm. Their bodies were then taken to the old Elkhorn site for permanent disposal. Drawing on his mine country expertise, Faulkner disarticulated the remains and scattered them into flooded galleries, keeping a few bones as grotesque keepsakes. The wagon, taken apart piece by piece in his shop, was dumped into the hidden shaft he knew about from his father's days in the mines. Evidence from the Bannock vault showed the network was broader than the 2 arrests suggested. The seized correspondence identified at least a dozen additional conspirators spread across 6 states. In a sweeping operation named New Covenant, in honor of the victims from Ezra's settlement, agencies moved in tandem, arresting the ring's members and freeing 4 young women still being held. The trial opened in March 2006 at the district court in Helena. Frank Morell and Gerald Faulkner received life sentences with a 30-year minimum before any parole review for kidnapping, unlawful imprisonment, rape, and the murder of minors. Their accomplices drew terms ranging from 15 to 25 years, depending on their roles. In total, the case resolved 11 disappearances and dismantled one of the most sophisticated trafficking networks ever uncovered in the region. For Ezra and Rachel Rousselin, the revelations finally delivered answers, but also a new depth of pain as they learned what their daughters had endured. Thinned by years of departures, the Brothers of the New Covenant voted to dissolve in 2007. Ezra, now in his 60s, spoke at the sentencing. "My daughters died refusing to surrender their faith and their dignity. They fought to the end against the men who tried to break their spirit. In our community, we say martyrs never truly die. Elizabeth and Tabitha will live forever in our memory, in the example they left of courage and fidelity." Samuel Beaumont, who returned from out of state to attend the trial, offered his final tribute. "Elizabeth was the purest and bravest woman I've ever known. That she fought to protect her sister and preserve her dignity doesn't surprise me. It's exactly who she was. Promoted to major after the case, Mary Frances Cross carried away a complicated victory. Duty fulfilled, yet bittersweet. "We solved the mystery," she said, "but we couldn't save Elizabeth and Tabitha. Our consolation is that we stopped others from suffering the same fate, and that we brought justice to two sisters who deserved long, happy lives." The Elkhorn shaft where their remains were found was permanently sealed and turned into a quiet memorial. A simple bronze plaque, installed by the county, bears their names and the names of all who suffered at the hands of this network. May their courage sharpen our vigilance. This tragedy is a hard lesson. Predators exploit the specific vulnerabilities of every community. Elizabeth and Tabitha's refusal to submit, even under threats and torture, revealed a strength of spirit that honors their memory. Their story also underscores the delicate balance between protecting cherished traditions and staying watchful against dangers from outside. Closed communities aren't necessarily safer. Sometimes isolation becomes a trap. What did you make of this 9-year investigation? Did you sense the scale of the network when that wagon surfaced from a forgotten mine? If this meticulous reconstruction moved you, consider following along for future cases. So stories like Elizabeth and Tabitha's, and the justice won in their names, are never forgotten.